Yeah.
All right. Okay. So we have a streaming on. Good midday, everyone. Almost a full house. Welcome to have a discussion on a very timely topic: Trump tariffs and trade, especially in the eve of this 25% tariffs for cars, which we just learned. Things are moving on. So indeed, we have had historic last week, historic last days, and the beginning of the year where things have changed dramatically, and it relates very much on trade. For European Union, for us, trade has been always the key policy. It has been also one of the most less controversial, at least until the TTIP. And on which European Union and countries have been very successful. You know, in last 20 years, from if you look EU economies and their relations to the dependency on trade, it has gone from 30 something to over 50 already. So very good until now. The new US administration, Trump, has taken very different kind of shocking stand. And as one of our think tankers here in Brussels and also a member of our academic council member, Jacob Kindergaard, just said a couple of days ago in The Economist, pointed out that before the trade was about economy, today is about geopolitics. And indeed, it for us, for European Union and Europeans, it's very difficult to make that connection because already trade, we are barely managing to manage the 27 different dynamics, but now we have to create a matrix of 27 different views on geopolitics. So very difficult equation. So the issues to what we will need to discuss and surely discuss also in this conference. Firstly, how to react to this trade threat. I guess the view is, on the other hand, to have a very clear response, to these tariffs, to have our euro to euro, dollar to dollar response. But on the other hand, it's very clear that European member states are not very enthusiastic. They are not ready and not enthusiastic to have this conflict. Of course, the hope is that somehow, with small adjustment or some kind of giving in on smaller issues, this threat will go away. Very instructive, at least in my view, is how our Canadian friends have replied. It's very interesting to follow how they communicate this issue to US administration, pointing out very clearly that they will, in a very polite, clear manner, that they will go where it hurts. They saying that, these areas are important for Trump. We are going after that. We are going to have Tesla, but this doesn't need to be the reality. And they're hoping that this negotiation will be completed successfully. So that first, how to respond. Secondly, how to diversify the risk and how to then, we need trade. So what other options we have? On the other hand, you can make an argument that actually European Union has done already a lot in trying to connect and have trade deals, India, Asia, different countries, and so forth. And in fact, Andrea, our moderator on this discussion, will next week we have a paper out on pointing out some of these ideas. But of course, the issue is that European Union has made an effort. The hope there is that maybe some other countries are more open in this situation to do trades. As an anecdote, you remember in the first Trump administration, we were negotiating with Japan many years. Then, Japan's prime minister went to US, had the first meeting with Trump. He went back to Tokyo and immediately came to Brussels and said, now we need to make a deal. And so maybe there is an openness for that. One big discussion which surely we will have is China, how to deal with China. I think that will be challenged already. If you look a little bit the different comments and media responses, we are seeing that some are saying that's a result of because of this situation, we have to turn to China, we have to enhance the cooperation, and some are already saying no, China is not the way to go. That's the one one approach where we can unite with the United States. So we have a big discussion on that. And third and final point is, of course, what does it mean? On this trade ethos, which we have been discussing since decades here in our dear EU bubble, always the multilateral trade deals, WTO, all that has been part of that. So how do we see that? And on the other hand, how do we see trade deals? There was, before all of this, already this discussion that trade should not be only about business, but we should have conditionality, all that included. How does it play now? And are we now forced to go to only for sectoral deals? So this is for introduction. It's a timely topic. I thank you very much for panelists, and I now give the floor to Andrea, our economist, who will then introduce the panelists and then moderate this exciting discussion. Thank you very much for coming, and Owen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tommy. Yes, just to let everybody know, this event has also been live streamed, and it will be made available on our YouTube channel in due course. We have about an hour for the discussion, just over an hour. So I'll come to the panelists, we'll have a discussion for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions near the end. Let me start by very briefly introducing our panel. A special welcome to Penny Nass from the German Marshall Fund in the United States. Penny heads up their Allied Competitiveness Program. She's a global public policy leader, and she's no stranger to the Brussels circuit, having worked here with both Citi and UPS. And she also spent over a decade in the US Department of Commerce. Next on her right is Hans Gribbe. Hans is co-founder and director of the Brussels Institute of Geopolitics. He's a former political advisor in the European Commission, where I think you dealt mostly with regulatory and industrial type policy. He's an author, and he is a founder of a very prominent public affairs firm here in Brussels. And lastly, but not least, we have Dirk Gottnick. Dirk was elected as an EPP MEP for the New Social Contract Party in the Netherlands in the last European elections. He sits on the Econ Committee in the European Parliament, which is the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, and he has also recently been appointed as Vice Chair of the European Parliament Special Committee on Europe's Housing Crisis. Prior to being elected an MEP, Dirk worked in the EPP group in the European Parliament, both as a political advisor and as spokesperson for EPP President Manfred Weber. So I think Tommy set the background out nicely. I think it's safe to say that JD Vance and Pete Exit last week confirmed a lot of kind of Europe's worst fears about how the second Trump administration could go in terms of transatlantic relations. I was just speaking to some of the speakers before the event, and while this event was conceived as a trade event, it's now impossible to conceive talking about trade without talking about lots of other geopolitical factors. That's the reality. Gone are the days when trade was a lovely technocratic profession populated by very clever lawyers who wrote very clever things to each other. Now it's a much more kind of political. It matters now. It matters a great deal to politicians, and that's why we're here today. Certainly the feeling I get in Brussels, Penny, just so you're aware, is that like Brussels feels like it's been just repeatedly slapped in the face by Washington. I think over the last couple of weeks, it feels like a weirdly kind of critical time in European affairs. So maybe I might just kind of come to you first. And I think the Brussels audience would be interested to know just how much bandwidth or attention Trump's European policy is actually getting in Washington at the moment. I know you're based in the trade area, but even his trade actions, are they getting much much kind of traction in Washington-based media.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks so much to the Martin Center for having me here today. Let me get to that in just 1 second, because I think I want to go back to something that was said at the beginning, which is that what you're seeing around, I think, U.S. policy with Europe is a really strong intermingling. I would actually go to Greenland first. So I think even before the inaugural, Trump was laying out certain things around Greenland that were providing hints of where things were going to be going. And then now you've added Ukraine policy, you've added the tariffs, you've added the free speech and the technology elements to it, and all of that is being intermingled in some of the conversations that are going on, and in particular around how tariffs are being used. So the Trump administration sees tariffs very much as rebalancing, and rebalancing global trade. Trump has had this position for 40 years plus. So it's really about, and he's very focused on goods, in part because goods and agriculture are seen as being much more, I think, connected to patriotism and to your citizens in a way that services are not similarly seen by some in the Trump administration. But once you go through rebalancing, you go to reshoring, then you get to the leverage, where you've seen Trump use leverage against Colombia, against Mexico and Canada on fentanyl. And then finally, it's about revenue. And revenue, I think, is the one that's the most of a stretch, just because if tariffs work, you should be collecting less of them over time. So as a source of revenue, they may not be the most stable. So when you think about this in the context of how much are people paying attention to all of this in Washington, well, I said I'm probably not a fair example because I work in trade, my husband works in trade, my ex-husband works in trade, and my daughter works in trade. So we got a lot of trade in my house. But I do have 3 teenage boys who don't follow trade. They just follow boy stuff. And they came to the dinner table the other day and said, "Hey, Mom, do you know that tariffs are going to help reshore jobs to the United States and repopulate our manufacturing?" And I said, "Okay, did you see this on TikTok, YouTube?" Yeah, that's where it popped up in my algorithm. And so I pulled out my computer and showed them a PowerPoint presentation on why tariffs are not the solution to all of the problems in the world. I then showed them a TikTok video I'd done. They called me cringe and hoped that their friends did not see that in their algorithm. So, but what I do think is that I think this administration, and I was listening this morning to a podcast yesterday that the New York Times did with Peter Navarra. And I think what is really important to understand is that I think that the administration, with the executive orders it's done, whether it be the American First Trade Policy Executive Order, and then some of the clarifications they've since done about how they want to look at reciprocal tariffs in the memo to the administration on how to pursue that portion of the American First trade policy. If you look at all of that, I think what's really coming is a desire to reshape and reform the entire U.S. trade legal system, as well as potentially the global trading system. And they started it under Lighthizer. He had some proposals at the end of the Trump administration about doing tariff negotiations at the WTO and reopening that up. He was already concerned then that many countries had very high tariffs while the U.S. had lower tariffs. And so I think what you need to keep an eye on is what happens after April 1st, which is when all of these memos are due on the American First trade policy. Now, here you'll probably be paying a lot of attention to the 25% tariffs on autos. I think autos are important, but I'd keep an eye on the pharmaceuticals, because I think that's also an industry that's incredibly important for Europe and Europe's competitiveness and innovation, and then semiconductors. And all of that, I think, will happen. But there'll be a whole series of memos about how the Trump administration is going to approach a wide variety of issues that are trade or trade aligned. And there's quite a few tax issues, which we can talk about later. But I think that you got to keep an eye on both the trade and the tax, because they're very interlinked.
So Penny, I was just wondering then, because I think the feeling in Brussels is probably, you mentioned it before we started, it's probably similar to how the Democrats feel, which is they feel that, Trump is, for those who like American football, flooding the end zone, and they've got so many targets, they're like seeing ghosts. They can't focus on any one issue. The EU was expecting something on trade. The European Commission had semi-prepared their proposals, etc. But I think the speed and the ferocity of the actions maybe on Ukraine, what he has already given away, perceived in Europe anyway, what he has already given away in the negotiations, but perhaps most damagingly of all, from a European perspective for the transatlantic relationship, is the Trump administration's focus, particularly J.D. Vance, on the internal workings of the European Union, migration, culture war, stuff like that. So I was just wondering if you were, advising people in Brussels, how can they kind of steady the ship for their own policy making? What should they really focus on? Should they focus on, trying to reach some sort of reciprocal agreement on trade? Should they focus on, getting their act together on security for Ukraine? I was just wondering what your kind of. I know it's a very kind of high level, big question, but honestly, Europe, they're the questions that Europe is trying to answer at the moment.
So I think there is a lot of flooding the zone going on. I think that's a very intentional. That's been a very intentional part of coming out of the gate for the Trump administration. And Steve Bannon's talked about it at length as a strategy to take. And I think part of that is, some things will get blocked and other things will get through because there's just so much going on. But at the same time, I think with some of this, you do have time. So with a lot of these trade announcements that have come out, they learned from putting in place the 10% tariffs on China, for example. They put those in place with 2 days' notice. And they put in place some really revolutionary stuff. It's a very esoteric issue called de minimis, and it's how the United States treats imports that are below $800. But they tried to make a change that, in my old firm, we had estimated would require us to hire tens of thousands of customs brokers to deal with that change. They tried to implement that in 2 days. And within 2 days, all the cargo facilities in the United States were full with packages and could accept no more. And so the president had to roll that back because they just didn't have the ability to execute on that vision quite yet. So I think he's learned that. But where should Europe go from this? I think a couple of things. So one is to focus on what he's saying. And so I think, you were talking about the Canadian response. I actually look at the Mexican response to the tariffs that were threatened on them. And the Mexicans stayed very focused on the border and fentanyl in what they proposed. And in fact, came back with their own ask, which was to tell the United States, you got to stop the guns from coming into Mexico. Because if you really want to stop the fentanyl coming in, the cartels are getting all their guns from the US. So we've got to have a task force on what the US, are going to do to stop the guns coming in. And then we're going to give you 10,000 soldiers at the border. And that's how they treated it. So part of it is to try to distill and really understand where the issues are coming. Because they'll throw a lot of spaghetti against the wall, but they'll repeat certain things over and over. And I think it goes back to this rebalancing question. It goes back to the trade deficit. And they keep talking about that. They keep talking about the fact that the auto tariff is at a different level in Europe than it is in the United States. And I think Sefcovic will talk about this today in Washington, how to rebalance that trade. And I think that's the important bit. But I think in business, and for those in the room from business, you know that when you're in a business, you talk about controlling what you can control. And I think that's what Europe really has to get their head around, is how do you, as Europe, come together and control what you can control? And I thought Draghi made important points about the internal market and some recommendations that needed to be made, followed through there. But I think it's also about what is Europe's vision for the world. And so where does Europe want to go with this? And can Europe be a leader of a third way of the countries that are out there that want that Trump was elected for change, and that's what I think the Democrats are struggling with, is how do you come from being the status quo that people voted against? How do you come up with that change mandate? They're working on that, but Europe's also got to work on that as well. And what is Europe's plan? What is Europe's recommendations? Not waiting for what the US does, but to proactively think about what is the type of world we want and how do we want to shape it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just when you mentioned the Democrats, I'm thinking of former Vice President Harris during the campaign when she was asked, what would she change, of President Biden's policies over 4 years, and she said that she couldn't think of anything. So I think Europe is kind of confronting the same question. Thanks, Penny. Hans, I'm going to come to you. We're kind of starting with trade, branching out into everything else. But I was just wondering how you would view the transatlantic trading relationship now. Would you view it as, okay, we're going to have an adversarial trading relationship and the EU needs to act accordingly?
Yeah, thanks. I have to say outright that I think Penny has a lot of family working in trade. I don't. I have family working in geopolitics, friends working in geopolitics. So my angle is perhaps slightly different, and I would make two quick points in terms of the future of the transatlantic relationship and the playbook. I think it will be very hard to understand the future of the trade relationship without knowing first what the security relationship with the United States will be. I think that's the primary question, and the trade question, the trade relationship, comes secondary. There was also these two issues are also, as was already remarked, entirely interlinked now. Yeah, so there was once a time when trade and security took place in different and separate domains. And the one was governed by autonomous WTO rules, the other by diplomacy and strategy. And by those days are obviously now completely over. And I think to understand what Europe needs to do, I think we need to understand the bigger security context. And the answer depends on that. And if you look at that bigger security relationship, I think there are currently at least two important scenarios for the future. And the first is that the United States kind of simply pulls out of Europe, leaving us to defend ourselves, and also the Ukraine, of course. And this, according to many, is the worst case scenario. For many obvious reasons. But I think there is a second scenario that is potentially even worse than the worst case scenario. And this is the scenario in which the United States continues to provide security, to offer security within NATO to the EU, to the Europeans, but it views this relationship, it views this security provision as a sort of a gangster-style protection racket, which will ultimately only make us poorer, weaker, and on the long term more dependent on the United States. Now, I'm not an expert in how the mafia works, but I have watched a lot of mafia movies in my life, and usually they involve a shopkeeper. There's always the story of a shopkeeper, a butcher, or a bar owner who then gets a visit by a wise guy, and basically the wise guy tells the owner, listen, you've got a nice shop here, but it's a dangerous world out there, you need protection, and you're lucky I'm in the business of providing protection, but you're going to have to give me 50% of your revenue. And of course, the shopkeeper says, well, that's quite a lot of money, and he says, why don't you just get lost? But of course, a week later, the shop is it's destroyed or mugged, and ultimately the shopkeeper has to hand over lots of his revenue. Now, I think if the United States views, if the Trump administration views the relationship in these terms, we of course into in much deeper problems than when it simply retreats from the continent. And of course, you can see this already taking place. Last week, I'm sure many of you have seen that in Munich at the security conference, the United States offered this deal to Zelensky, saying, "Listen, we might be able to help you in the future, security guarantees and so on, but we'll need, in return, 50% of your natural resources economy." It's kind of the shopkeeper who gets, shaken down by, the mafia. And of course, we see this also potentially happen with the EU. Yeah, there's the case of Greenland. There is the regulation, the DSA, the Digital Service Act, which regulates, amongst other, Elon Musk's X, which, as we know, J.D. Vance says, if you find X and other companies, we might pull out of NATO. There are all the tariffs that are hanging over our heads, which we, I suppose, could be asked to just swallow, because otherwise, he will leave us in the lurch with the Russians. There's our China policy. We can be asked to simply mirror what the United States does without further discussion. Then there are the billions of euros we may be asked to spend on American military kit and essentially on American jobs and not on European kit and European jobs and so on. And this list of potential things that we have to pay in return for protection is potentially endless. And it ultimately leads to a place where we will be more and more dependent. It's a vicious circle, and we just need America more and more and more. So I think I'm worried more about this second scenario, and the implications for our trade policy are huge. If it's the first scenario, and the United States in time just pulls back and says, you guys, you got to do it yourself. I can see an autonomous trade policy. I can see a trade negotiation between the EU and the US taking place, of which the outcome is reasonably balanced, because we have a big economy, and the United States sells a lot of services in the EU as well. So there is some sort of balance that can be found. But if we remain locked in this security dependency, I think it's really hard to see how we can be like Canada and Mexico, because we are different, because we depend on the United States for our security against the Russians, and there it's just hard to see how we can actually have an autonomous trade policy at all.
Okay, thanks, Hans. It's interesting because as economists, we tend to kind of go immediately to the trade issue to see if that can be resolved, while those interested in geopolitics tend to focus on the security. Dirk, coming to you, like ultimately trade, geopolitics, it's all going to come down to whoever the Prime Minister is, whoever the President of the Commission is, it's going to come down to political leadership. I was just wondering, I know it's early days, but in the European Parliament, can you see any kind of outlines of core priorities or red lines that, the EU leaders will stand by?
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for inviting, by the way. It's a very interesting debate. I think the headline after the elections was already competitiveness. The shift moved very quickly to the economy after 5 years of a tidal wave of regulatory production. Brussels was basically mass-producing regulation to transform our economy into something that we believed would be the future. And I guess somewhere a couple of days after the elections, we looked around us and we looked over at Washington and we looked over at China, and we found out that actually we're only the only ones actually thinking still that future is going to be that future. The rules have changed, and I think one of the questions is the US very quick or are we just very slow? I mean, sorry. With the emergence of China as a potential competitor to dominance of the US in the world, the US needs to change the rules of the game. And that's what they're doing. And they're doing that. And Obama was here. He told us in our faces, get your security together. He was here, Obama. How long was that ago? We had warnings about we need a trade deal with the US. Imagine having a trade deal now with the US. Tariffs. Makes no sense at all, because you wouldn't even be able to impose tariffs, because you would have actually a trade deal. So who's quick and who's slow? I think Europe is just, we have been wishful thinking for now more than a decade about what our American friends have in mind for the future. But the reality is that future is not very bright. It is a future of massive conflict, and trade conflict, but geopolitical conflict. And the impact of the message, we might pull our combat-ready forces out of Europe, is just, I mean, it's a massive moment in every headquarter, planning quarter, here at NATO, everywhere, everyone's now in like, holy shit, what happened? And excuse my French. But so also the Dutch parliament and any parliament in Europe now is thinking, okay, the general asked what combat operational sort of abilities can member states now deliver before the 24th of February, because he needs to report to the American president what they can put together in Europe. That's what parliaments are talking about now. And that's about sending men and women into very dangerous places. Again, so this is not, this is, and there, I somewhat agree that this geopolitical level now has just moved everything off the agendas, everything, and dominates the debate. It has accelerated, I think, and maybe thank God, and Wilfried Martens was the one to say that never lose a good crisis, but it accelerates the talk about our single market. Because we have found out that, and I think Germany has found out very painfully, that the export model for the future is not the model to be able to rely on to finance demographic change and all the social security they have. They need a economic engine somewhere. It's called the single market. But we haven't integrated it in the past 50 years, because we were simply hoping that this WTO-based world, the world of the flat world of people that have McDonald's, they don't fight with each other, that would somehow persist, and it didn't. So it's a rude awakening, but I don't think we should be, I mean, fatalist. Draghi said yesterday in Parliament, we're basically imposing an internal, intra-European tariff of 45%, simply because we don't have an integrated energy market. We are horrible on interconnectors. We are not serious on defense cooperation. And with something like drones, for example, it's quite easy for Europe to do that, because here, actually, this place doesn't really work for geopolitics, because it's all about redistribution and dividing the cake between 27 countries. With drones, it actually works because we need millions of them. So every single member state can start producing them and have their own sort of little drone factory and production capacity. But on the trade relations, I think we have to start with growing, sort of integrating ourselves, financial markets, telecom still, energy infrastructure, the basic stuff that gets the cost of living down for people and for businesses, that gets us into a stronger position at any negotiation table, whether it's about security or whether it's about trade. So the rules have changed. Trump will not wait for us to get our acts together. Simply, they will act. They do that everywhere. Whether they thrive in chaos, and because they are simply a sovereign power, they don't need anyone else to do anything. Europe needs always someone. Whether we need to move a battalion or whether we need to move. Well, you were talking about cargo. I'm a rapporteur for the customs union reform in Europe. We have a de minimis as well, 150 euros. And we're going to get rid of it. but it is a very big deal because, and that's where Trump also has a problem. World trade is so integrated and so fluid that if you just simply stop one sort of, you make an unthoughtful move, you fill up a port like Rotterdam in a matter of hours. In a matter of hours, you can block global trade flows. It's like what's called this evergreen boat in the Suez Canal. That's what happens then. So it's very easy to have big words about it, but trade flows will be trade flows. And the ports will be open, it will be fluid, and I think that we have to just simply keep calm, stop moaning about what's happening over there, and start integrating some essential parts. We have to do less, but the stuff that we do, we have to do much better. And I think that's where Europe can actually take a lead.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think your line is the US very quick or the EU just very slow is a good line. I might borrow that from you with your permission, of course. But isn't it amazing, Hans, I'll bring you back in as I'll work back towards Penny, is that, you know, it's taken the US and President Trump, as Dirk said, you know, probably 15 years after Obama said it, that it's taken the US to make the EU ask these questions about ourselves, so that ultimately, you know, we can do a deal on trade, transatlantic trade or whatever, but ultimately, you know, it's down to the Europeans to, you know, get their act together on security and defence in other certain ways. And I have found maybe that, you know, probably the 1990s was the last time where the EU really took its own future into its hands. With German reunification, we had a movement towards the euro currency throughout the 1990s, and we were moving towards enlargement and getting Central and Eastern Europe back into the European family. But it seems that, and probably around 2000, as Tommy well knows, we had the Lisbon agenda, which was this competitiveness agenda. We were going to be the competitive global economy. And whatever's happened over the last 25 years, I'm not so sure. Certainly a combination of crisis has slowed down the EU's ability to take risks, the EU's preference to build momentum in these areas. But Hans, I was just wondering, where do you see the leadership coming from in Europe? Because, you know, as an EPP think tank, it would be remiss of me not to mention the forthcoming German elections. There's a lot of hopes placed in Herr Merz compared to the outgoing German government. And I was just wondering, you know, do we have a Kohl, Thatcher, Mitterrand clique in the EU at the moment that can kind of deliver this leadership? It's more a kind of a political, geopolitical question.
Yeah, no, I believe that the leadership needs to come from the member states. I think there is in the bubble here in Brussels. I think there is a perception. There is an easy perception that this is the moment in which Brussels, the EU institutions, can need to rise to the fore, take the initiative, and lead us out of the darkness. But I think ultimately that sort of leadership requires a huge amount of legitimacy, and the kind of legitimacy, that kind of legitimacy is only found in the member states. You can't expect the Commission, you can't expect von der Leyen to lead Europe or to be the voice of Europe vis-à-vis the United States at this moment. It must come from elected leaders, and in the end, like always in the history of the Union, that means essentially France and Germany. To some extent, you could speculate about the UK, even though they're now outside of the Union. But ultimately, it needs to come from France and Germany, and we have, of course, in France now a weakened president. Who is still, as you can see these days, is trying to take the lead by bringing together, by convening other leaders. But we ultimately need a strong German chancellor. And until the elections, which are this weekend, if I'm not mistaken, of course, nothing is really going to happen. Yeah, it requires these elections to take place and for Germany to form a government. And I think at that point, I think that is when we should expect, or we should at least hope, for some new momentum to confront, the really sort of difficult position that we are in. And I think we are going through a revolution, a global revolution. I think Donald Trump and his MAGA movement, they are uprooting everything. Yeah, NATO, WTO, GATT, Bretton Woods. Everything is going into the wood chipper, yeah, as the phrase is from Elon Musk. The United States is also challenging our own political freedom. Yeah, it's trying to appoint governments, impose governments on us, and it's calling for Ukraine to organize a new elections and so on. So this requires a massive European response. And you refer to the 90s. I think we've got to go back even further to the very sort of founding of the EU, and to initiatives such as sort of the Community for Coal and Steel. If you look at, for example, one of the challenges is clearly to consolidate Europe's defense industry. That is not a question of the merger rules or adapting, the regulations here in Brussels, but it requires top-level political willingness of a number of member states. It don't need to be all, to start something which is entirely new, kind of an industrial consolidation of what are now still sort of national champions often in the defense industry. So I think, just very briefly, a lot of my hope is focused on Germany, and I hope your candidate will not leave us disappointed. I spoke at another event yesterday, and there was an American speaker who said, "The Europeans never disappoint to disappoint." Yeah, so I think the expectations are what they are, but I'm still hopeful that something will happen.
Yeah, thanks, Hans. I want to come back at the end. I want to come back particularly to ask another political question. But Penny, you said something in your earlier response which stuck in my mind, is that, can the EU be a leader of a third way? And it's funny, when you mention the third way, I automatically think of like late stage Tito Yugoslavia, where for a considerable period of time, Tito was very successful in utilizing Western finance to maintain the charade of a healthy, communist, centrally planned economy. But I'm just thinking then, it got me thinking that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I can think of two other global economies that are heavily dependent on trade with the United States, and which also have which are also very dependent on explicit security guarantees from Washington. And that's Japan and South Korea. So I'm just, the paper we're working on in the Martin Centre at the moment is, the title we decided to give it was Hedging Chaos, because it's about the EU learning to flex its economic muscles a bit more, seeking to deepen the relationship with Tokyo and Seoul and other like-minded nations like that. I was just wondering, do you think that's a kind of a feasible strategy at a macro level for Europe to hedge? And that might also include, at some stage, China, because I think there's an increasing worry in Europe that Trump may not be trusted on China. We've seen some action on TikTok. We've seen some delayed action on Chinese tariffs. I'm just wondering what your view is on that.
So let me start with the China piece.
Yeah.
I think we are still seeing the evolution of the China policy of the Trump administration, and I don't think it will necessarily be a carbon copy of the Biden administration. Whether it's TikTok, whether it's, you look at what's happening with Russia as a blueprint, you can see a a much more transactional relationship. But also Trump respects Putin and Xi because they're strongmen. And he respects the strong, and he does not pay attention to the weak. And so I think that we're going to continue to see that evolution with the Chinese, and there'll be the occasional swats back and forth and things that they're unhappy with. I think the DoD is going to be very focused on boosting U.S. defense capabilities to think about war more in the Asia theater than in the Europe theater. But I think that's where it's going. So when I think of what Europe could do, I mean, you've got Canada, you've got Australia, you've got Japan, you've got South Korea, you've got several countries some of whom have also had changes in governments, but who are kind of grappling with this new world dynamic and not necessarily wanting to go either in a US camp or in a China camp. So where do they head? And is there some kind of, again, alternative, particularly as we're likely to see the WTO and a lot of international institutions come under great challenge. If the Trump administration moves forward with their reciprocal tariff plan, that will basically be walking away from the WTO and the principles around global trade of most favored nation treatment and non-discrimination. So I think, this is where we're headed. And I'm not saying that it should be sobering. It should be action forcing. And again, I was in a lot of European capitals. In some I saw fear, and in some I saw anger. And I think the anger is better, because once you have anger, then you can start to formulate plans and execute and think about where you go and be prepared for what's going to happen. But when you're fearful, you're prohibited from action. And so the one thing I would say here in Brussels, the heart of the administrative capital of Europe, but not necessarily the heart of the executive action of Europe, is to think about how do you arrange your administrative powers in a way to allow that quick executive action that you're going to need in Europe moving forward. And if there's one thing I think Europe could do and Brussels could do, it is to get hands around the energy issue. Because I think one of the things that holds Europe back the most, and if people are excited about roaming charges on cell phones and money back for plane tickets if you have a 2-hour delay, by gosh, I think a whole lot of people in Europe would be really excited about their energy bills going down and having that be something that you can directly attribute to what happens in this capital, as well as will help maintain the manufacturing you're going to need. The last thing I would say when I think about all this, and I want to you talked about drones. And what a great success story for Europe in a unfortunate circumstance. Yeah. But you guys are now some of the most innovative drone manufacturers for both commercial and military purposes. And what a great case study for how fast that happened, what happened, where does it go? It's revolutionized warfare. They're having to figure out how this now works in the Asia theater. How does it work with ships and with other aircraft? And find those success stories, find those opportunities, and say, how do we lean into that? How was that a success? As opposed to, I think, some of the fears that are going on. That would be my suggestion for a path forward.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's
maybe not a direct answer to your question.
No, but it's
can I say?
Yeah.
Can I say something to that? Because I think it's really because we're not without instruments, but if we stick to only doing how we always did it, we will get the same results. And there's a real question on the table. Is this possible? Energy, defense, everything that has to do with sort of resilience and security. Is that possible with 27? It's a good question. Financial market integration, yeah? There are quite some big financial markets in Europe, but they're not in all the 27 member states. And are we, as Europe, going to choose for how we always made the sausage? Or are we going to do something, try to be quicker? The Commission, and I was very happy with that, is even said, our Commissioner has said that she would not stop the goal from achieving the goal if it meant that we had to reduce the amount of member states that were participating in it. But for the Commission, it's obviously very difficult to show leadership on that, because there you have the treaties, you have the 27 member states. But if we do not become more dynamic, quicker, we will simply get the same results. And the energy integration, it is for 2 decades from now. And we don't have that time.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just, there's a lot of big issues, just trying to formulate it in a coherent way. We've got about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to go to the audience to see if there are any questions. Please put your hand up. Okay, and we can do a first round. We'll take the lady there first.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sandra Kaduri. I'm Director of Keeping Channels Open, a dialogue network. Just a question on whether the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, is still alive, and who is there still good to work with in the US? I mean, there must be many people who still understand the values of trade, other alliances, other leverage we have. And secondly, how far is this a problem of communications? I mean, where is the fight back on a joint narrative to sell the idea of mutually beneficial trade, the need for alliances for deterrence and strength, the dangers of disinformation? I don't hear enough. I hear from the EU, but I don't hear at the member state level enough of a real sales pitch on why we need rules-based world order and why we need this cooperation. Where is that?
Okay, I think we have, yeah. Yeah, go ahead, please. Just let us know where you're from and your question.
Yes. Hello, I'm Jacob Cooper from the Ludwig von Mises Institute Europe. And my question is, Trump earlier says that he would like members of NATO to increase their spending on their militaries up to 5% of their GDP, and believes that members of NATO are not pulling their appropriate weight. How does this kind of connect with the idea that Trump is kind of playing like a mafia boss kind of role in the transatlantic ally organizations, and how should these NATO allies respond?
Okay, we'll take one more. Peter, maybe I'll take you at the back.
Thank you very much, Peter Hiffele, Policy Director of the Martin Center. Penny, you mentioned the issue of taxation slightly in the introduction. Is this the new battlefield? Because we have seen a lot of initiatives on the OECD level in recent years to harmonize, to overcome issues. And this is a massive impact, of course, on trade and tariffs in a direct or more indirect way. So maybe a few comments on that topic, please.
Yeah, we'll go with those 3 questions. If anybody has anything in particular they want to answer, just let me know. But yeah, indeed, Penny, America, the United States has pulled out. My understanding is that the United States has pulled out of the OECD framework,
Global minimum
global tax. And I'm just wondering maybe if you could explain what is the US thinking in that regard?
Yeah, so a couple of things on the taxation front, and then I'll come to the NATO and TTC quickly. So I think that you can divide some of the tax issues into different buckets. So there's the global minimum tax, which is something that, frankly, a lot of the tax-specific people in Washington haven't necessarily been happy with how I think the negotiations have been going at the OECD. And they believe that some of the decisions that have been made in that would drop the US, and particularly how some of our corporate tax benefits are provided below the minimum tax threshold. In a way that would disadvantage the United States and could potentially have nations like in Europe reach in and grab certain taxation and bring it back to Europe. That is really an untenable position, both for the US Congress, who does see tax authority as their right. They may be letting Trump run ragged on their tariff authority, but tax authority is something that they will guard very carefully. And so I think that there are some things that happened in the Pillar 2 discussions at the OECD that are hard to come back from and that have made that very problematic for the US to implement. I know that Europe has already put it in the laws. China has not, India has not, many other countries have not. So that, I think, is going to be a very tough thing to come back from. Where I think there are areas of negotiation, and you've seen it in some of the conversations during the confirmation hearings, in Europe, you have quite a process-heavy carbon border adjustment mechanism, which goes after carbon taxation kind of at the border level. I would say that process has problems when only 20% of companies are complying with it. It's just way too heavy, and I've tried to help a company fill out their paperwork for that, and it's almost impossible. Simplification there is going to be important, but you have seen the US administration say that they see that there could be some alignment between what Europe's doing on carbon tax at the border and what the US wants to do on a pollution fee that's speak for carbon tax but without saying carbon tax. So that's an area of opportunity. Digital sales tax could potentially be an area of opportunity for discussion. What is going to, I think, be extremely hard is the US has now thrown VAT in. And with 177 countries using a VAT, I think that's going to be just a brick wall for the US to run into, and they're going to have to figure that out. I think they're using it to kind of goose up the numbers for their reciprocal tariffs package, and that'll be something that gets negotiated away because it's very clear the VAT is non-trade distortive as a tax. So, and there's a lot of evidence on that friends of mine at the Tax Foundation can provide. On the TTC, I think that there are some pockets inside the US administration that believe there are certain elements of the TTC that should continue. TTC was proposed at the end of the Trump administration. So, and while the Biden administration implemented it, again, it got a bit unwieldy with 10 working groups and lots of side conversations and studies and reports and this and that. There were some successes, but I think you'll see a much more slimmed down TTC from a very specific perspective as a possibility to be considered, because there will be a need for a dialogue on some issues coming up. The question's just going to be, again, I think both sides coming and showing that it can be a useful use of time. And that's where I think, they need to devise the agenda extremely carefully for that.
Thanks, Penny. Yeah, it's very interesting because maybe I'm wrong, but my assumption is that because the US pulled out of the OECD agreement, that many EU member states will now seek to reintroduce their digital sales tax or digital service taxes, which will further complicate the already complicated relationship, no?
Indeed. Digital sales tax, and then you throw in the aviation subsidies is on a standstill. That's going to expire. You've got steel and aluminum. You've got all of these tariffs that are coming out. Very complicated potential landscape. But again, you have a president in the United States who very much likes to make deals.
Yeah. Dirk, I presume that we're going to see, your assessment would be that we're going to see movement in countries like the Netherlands, in Belgium, with regard to increasing spending on security and defence. And I guess for the Netherlands, having the Secretary General of NATO
it's a bit of an obligation.
Applies a little bit of pressure. Yes, exactly.
We don't have much of a choice, which is actually the headline of this. We don't have much of a choice, and that's why we're so uncomfortable about it. But the fact is that spending on defense is quite difficult, and spending a lot on defense is also very difficult. Most of the unspent money in the Dutch ministries is in the Ministry of Defense, because you need people, you need a concept, we're buying 4 submarines, but they're going to be done in 35 or probably later. Yeah? So it's not something, spending a lot of money is not easy on defense. And you cannot compensate in a couple of years what you've done in decades of underinvestment. And that's where the US has a huge advantage, because they have a critical mass that they have simply invested in for decades on end. But I wanted to add to Penny, because I think the taxation issue will be quite crucial. And maybe just to complement also all the digital stuff. So a lot of the Trump's financiers come from the Silicon Valley sort of Peter Thiel environment, Elon Musk. They hate the Digital Markets Act. They hate the DSA. They are in full frontal attack on it at the moment. And they've seen that Apple had this fine of 13 billion, what was it, and Ireland doesn't know what to do with the money. They don't like it, and they see it as a challenge to their business model. I don't know where that's going to end, but it will be. It is a quite serious challenge to sort of how Europe is going to, in terms of regulatory power, what will be transactional there, and if Europe can at all do anything there. Yeah. But from and then the last point on this leadership issue, I totally agree with Hans. We need to get the Franco-German engine back on. It's been absent for 10 years. It's really been a problem. And if we don't go back to the basics, the root of it, it has to start growing from there. And there, Merz has a huge responsibility. And Macron, for whatever the credibility he has left, will need to also connect to that. Because Paris on Ukraine has not been the biggest deliverer. And the fact that they organize a conference in Paris about it is, I find, slightly misplaced. But then again, it's a good backdrop. It's a nice picture, but it's about delivery on the ground. And there we need really a connection between Berlin and Paris again. And in fact, in my view, the first trip of Merz needs to be to Paris, and then maybe even together to Washington. I mean, that's the kind of relationship I think we're thinking about now.
And I wonder, Dirk and Hans, I was just thinking, because I had a question about, what are Europe's red lines? But, just from speaking to politicians, I really feel that tech regulation and the whole technology space might be a red line for Europe. Sure, we can do deals on trade, we can beef up security, but because I believe that the difference between Washington and Brussels on that particular area is cultural. It's a societal ability or a societal awareness of privacy, what level of privacy is expected, protections. And I think a lot of Europeans look at American, I'm just talking about, ordinary people on the street that we meet at different events. We see that a lot of Europeans look at the US digital space, particularly the US online space, and they think that that's not the model we want to follow.
But then why don't you have any companies here that are producing models that you want?
Exactly.
Yeah. But that
the Commission runs on Oracle.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
The International Criminal Court in The Hague is Microsoft Cloud Services.
Yeah.
The American companies could shut down government in Europe.
But that's my point. Is that.
So what about red lines? So there's no red lines there. There's simply dependencies, very profound dependencies. So infrastructure, we will never recreate the infrastructure on digital that has been created by these companies. It will simply not be possible. What we can do is sort of innovate on AI, for example, the models, and many of them are open source, whether it's the Chinese or the American one. We can build on that, and I think we can learn a lot and actually jump the. Now we're doing what developing countries did with our technologies. Yeah, they jumped fast forward in time, and that's what we now also have to do. We have to integrate the technology that exists elsewhere and go quicker with it, and that's where we have opportunities, I think, especially on AI, on quantum, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I think there's different types of tech regulation, many different kinds, and I think the one that is politically the most sensitive is the DSA. So this is the whole matter of censorship, yeah? And this is, of course, a prime concern for Musk and for X, and it's been highly politicized. And I think that some of the other issues out there, I think they are much more easily conquered in any discussions. Yeah? I mean, the Trump administration, correct me if I'm wrong, Penny, takes a relatively ambivalent view to the market power of some US tech companies as well. Yeah, so Google is extremely powerful in terms of market share in the United States. Now, traditionally, we in Europe have some questions around that, but so does the United States. And Even Trump has in the past said that he personally also isn't entirely convinced that this is the right model. But if it comes to the DSA and the issue of censorship and what has happened in Germany, and particularly the interventions by Elon Musk in German domestic politics, it's very hard for the Europeans to now climb down on that, and give up on the DSA or dilute it massively. So I think there is something like a red line. It depends, but there is where there's huge potential for a major fist fight between both sides. Can you imagine if the European Commission decides to impose a 13 billion fine on X? Now I think you don't have to wait very long for the tweet from the Oval Office to arrive overnight.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It goes back to the cultural issue, because in Ireland we generally say that Europe needs to make up its mind on digital, because in a lot of ways the EU wants its cake and it wants to eat it at the same time. Because if you go big on regulation, you're not going to have the Googles and the Microsofts. So it's very interesting. I think we have time for one or two questions just before. I'll take the first two gentlemen here just because I see them directly.
Thank you. Kurt Geisert, I'm one of the guides in the House of European History. Mr. Kribbe, if you speak of France and Germany, should we not add Poland? Should we not be optimistic then Mr. Merz will be the next chancellor in Germany, that there will be a revival of the triangle of Weimar, France, Germany and Poland?
Thanks so much. My name is Thomas Thaler. I work as a consultant here in Brussels. My question would be, first, shouldn't we also add, because probably that's someone that has a good relationship to Trump, Italy, and Giorgia Meloni, who is, according to Mr. Trump, a fantastic woman. Different opinions, but probably just to follow up. And the other one was on diversification and being proactive. I think we talked in the past a lot about free trade agreements. There's debate about Mercosur, Southeast Asia, but I think more and more resistance in many member states. Mercosur, I think about France, Poland, Ireland, Austria, many others that go along this protectionist line. But wouldn't it be this the right recipe for being proactive? Look for trading partners elsewhere, as we did with Japan, South Korea, and Canada in the past. Maybe also the UK, because it was mentioned there is not enough appetite from the new Labour government, but probably it's also an opportunity, this crisis, to come closer together again, including on trade. So thanks so much for some feedback from actually all of you. Thanks.
Yeah, so we had indeed about Poland, headed by Donald Tusk, becoming a very important, not just a very important economy, but a very important military player within the EU, and also about Meloni and diversification. I'm not sure, Derek Hans, if anybody wants to...
Very, very quickly, I agree that obviously it can't be just Germany and the old Axis. But it has to start somewhere, and I think you can't do it without them either. Yeah, so I would, of course, extend invitations to others, including Meloni. But without a functioning Axis, the traditional setup, we won't get anywhere. Yeah, it's not by no means enough to have the two involved, but it's where it starts. And I think there's a second element there, which we look to either Germany or Paris for, or both, which is who talks to Trump in the end. Yeah, so that can't be von der Leyen, but it can't be Meloni either, because there are issues of trust between including the EPP and Meloni. Yeah, so whilst she's very close, this may be an asset that we can use, but she's not ultimately the person who can, I believe, who can actually lead negotiations with Donald Trump.
Okay, Dirk, do you want to say a final
Yeah,
word?
well, I would agree. I think she probably has a very good relation, but she's also one of the more dependent ones on the US and very exposed. She has a big budget surplus. He doesn't like that. So I would be, that's simply also simple Italian interest, national interest, and she's doing her job as prime minister to cover that. So I fully understand. On Mercosur at the moment in the European Parliament, there's no majority. Very simple. And they would, in the UK, they would call this an oven-ready deal, I think. And the higher the pressure or the mess in the trade will get, the more I think maybe another debate about international or trade agreements can start. But we should not be mistaken. I mean, China went to Brazil and signed I don't know how many agreements in a matter of a couple of weeks. We're talking about 20 years of negotiations for the EU. Again, are the others so quick, or are we just so slow? I think China is now negotiating more than 30 trade agreements with neighboring countries. So it is they actually are doing what we used to do, and we stopped doing it. And it is very difficult to change that narrative in the European Parliament, and I think even in Council, even. There are French wine producers that would gain a lot from Mercosur, and they're in favor of it, but they do not dare to communicate about it because it's simply a toxic topic. So there's a lot of sectors that could gain from something like that. But that's also where we are stuck. But again, for me, the question is inside Europe, and the first sort of put the energy prices, the actual integration of the single market. Trade deals, it's a good plus and a nice add-on, but politically extremely challenging.
Yeah, and I think probably we need to move away from the traditional Brussels approach, which was, these all-encompassing free trade agreements. I think we need to go sectoral, and we need to go a lot more strategic. The last Commission did very interesting things on data flows and economic security in those specific areas with countries like Japan. So I think if we can learn to be...
But won't Europe be well prepared for a world where the WTO crumbles?
No.
No.
You have more trade agreements than the U.S. The U.S. is going to have everything on a bilateral basis. We only have, 9-10 agreements in the United States. So
I guess it comes back to the related kind of huge dependencies we have and how they can be weaponized,
I mean, the other thing I think Europe has to look very hard at itself, because the United States, and tariffs are not such a big deal for the United States, in part because only 20% of our GDP is incumbent on exports. And in Europe, you have Germany that has almost 70% of their GDP as export-driven. So I get the point about defense taking a long time, and I get the point about other stuff, but you do have tremendous manufacturing capabilities here that could be repurposed if there is the desire and the energy to move forward with that. And I think you'll have to see countries make those tough decisions. It requires moving away from some of the social spending to doing certain other things. It requires certain countries stepping up who are only putting in 1% of their GDP into defense at the moment, and identifying those vulnerabilities. We haven't talked about it, but in the Colombia tweet and initial plan, Trump shut off access to the U.S. financial markets for Colombian banks. So he shut off licenses and dollar trade was what he was threatening. Think about that in your banking sector, if that were to happen, if things got really bad. So there's stuff out there. It could, going to your point, it could get worse. But Europe has a lot that it could do itself. And the stronger of a partner Europe is, the more desirable it might be for the U.S. to come back to it at some point.
It's interesting, Penny, because when we were thinking about doing this event, it was
Valentine's Day?
No, it was before Christmas, and it was closer to Halloween.
Yeah.
And we found your allied competitiveness programs, and we thought about similarities of our own stuff that we're doing here in the Martin Centre. But what had struck me is that, this event was originally conceived as kind of a trade event. But actually, trade now was only one very small part of it. And I feel that probably your most important role today was almost as a kind of therapy session for Europeans because, at the moment they're pretty confused, and I think we need many more of these type of exchanges. I think it's very, very important. I was determined before I finish to finish on an optimistic note. So Penny, you led me perfectly into it, because in all the doom and gloom, and I think that was the one mistake that Draghi made with the Draghi report, in the sense of, sure, it was great economic analysis, but he didn't offer a political pathway. Saying that we need 5% of GDP per year investment is not a political pathway for politicians. It's just not a viable option. But I think for everything that Europe is, that you mentioned, one thing that we are not is poor. It's just that we choose not to utilize our resources. We have, the EU 27 has 33 trillion in household savings. On a per capita basis, that's significantly higher than the US. 34%, so we're talking about 12 or 13 trillion euros, is sitting in bank and deposit accounts, probably earning 1-2% interest at the moment. That compares to 14% in the US, 34% in Europe. The savings rate in the EU 27 is about 15%, and it's been pretty consistent, and it's even higher in countries like Italy and Spain. That compares to less than 5% in the US. So when people say, what I hope, and Dirk, I hope you'll be able to help us with this, I hope we don't spend the next 12 months talking about how we need joint borrowing is essential for defence. What's essential for, long-term sustained investment in defence and security is capital markets union and being able to access this cash. And the final statistics, which I think is very interesting, is that debt to GDP in the EU as a whole is 40 percentage points lower than it is in the US. Federal gross debt, and it's one of the reasons why Musk is cutting federal spending. So I think, the EU is not poor, very sophisticated legal and other systems. But I would argue, and the Martin Centre would argue, that we should focus on 4 things explicitly. We need a coherent strategy. That's a collective strategy. It could be a multi-speed Europe. We need to be open to that. We need political leadership. It has to be based on the Franco-German relationship. We need to focus on getting our own economic house in order, irrespective of what's going on in Washington. And we need to hedge chaos by building our global presence. With that, I just want to thank everybody for coming. Penny, I appreciate you taking the time. I know you're very busy jetting around Europe at the moment. Hans and Dirk also for coming for the Parliament. We have a light lunch served, so thank you all for coming.
Thank you.